What we're going to be doing is going through form and function of the human body, and we're going to be talking about fascia today, fascia, as Thomas Myers says. And Andy went through bones and muscles, super important, the skeletal-muscular system, how the muscles and the bones interact in the body, their positions and their functions, and great stuff in terms of understanding the names of the muscles, because that really does help to understand the movements of the muscles. And that's what we're going to be working through today. So, first of all, concepts. We understand through our actions, through our experiences so far in TIFA about the causes and effects of our lifestyle. So we've covered things in diet, things in terms of food, how that has an effect on our body, and where there's a cause to that effect. We're looking at this dynamic relationship between the form, the function, the outcome of the function, and how that outcome then affects the form again. So when we're talking about anatomy, we're talking about our structure. We're then talking about how that structure moves in terms of our biomechanics, the mechanics of that structure. And we're then talking about how those movements are affecting our physiology. But it doesn't just go one way, it goes the other way as well, because our anatomy is our structure. And then the physiology of that is what's facilitating the ability of our biomechanics, which means that, say, for example, we eat food that causes more inflammation. This will then affect our physiology in a way, as Andy's mentioned already. One of the things that we might see happening if we're inflamed is you might have a decreased range of motion or immobility occurring at a specific joint. And then, of course, this can affect the way that we can move because of that range of motion that we have available. So again, we have that form, the anatomy. When we think about form in terms of exercise, we could say that form is maybe something along the lines of how you're doing it, but we're going to just focus on form being anatomy for now. The function is the physiology, how the body is functioning in terms of the chemical responses in the body, the electrical responses in the body, and the way that that then is also going to impact the biomechanics, and the way that this is a dynamic interrelated experience. So why are we doing this? The key for why we're doing this is because we're trying to optimize our performance. So essentially, we're optimizing our performance through physiological aspects such as lifestyle in terms of diet. Going to be going into more of the mind stuff and working through like emotions and that as well, where that is contributing electrochemically to the way that we're experiencing life. Another side of that is the mechanical side of it, which is quite literally the structure, the way the structure is positioned and moves, and then the physiological outcomes of this in terms of how our body adapts to what we're doing all the time. These two things combined will then facilitate optimal performance. If we have good physiology, but we have something affecting our mechanics, it's not going to be optimal. If we have good mechanics, but there's something affecting our physiology, again, it's not going to be optimal. And what we're looking to do is find out, as every person is different, we all have different structures, designs. We're all human. We all have a very similar shape. We're all chimp-like. But essentially, what we're looking to do is find out if there's ways that we can adjust the functions of our body, the posture of our body, to then be able to improve our experiences in life and to actually be able to maximize our ability to be able to move, and the longevity or the sustainability of our movement practice and our joints, muscles, bones, physical structure. All of the time, we're regenerating and we're also degenerating. So what we're needing to do is optimize our ability to regenerate while also minimizing the factors that are contributing to degeneration. And the first concept that we're going to talk about is tensegrity. Andy mentioned about this yesterday, and tensegrity is the tension in the system that maintains the integrity of the system. when we think about the bones, we're generally thinking about things stacking. And essentially what happens inside of our body is that the tension between the muscles in the fascia, which is a connective tissue, is essentially causing the body to float within itself. And if we start to think about how we evolved, we didn't evolve with our feet on the floor, maybe with our bums on branches, but essentially what we're looking at now is the evolution and adaptation of human structure. So you can see this image here of the bridge, and this is islands of compression, such as bones, floating in a balanced sea of tension, such as muscle and fascia, or myo, Latin myo for muscle, Greek even, and then fascia, Latin for band, because the fascia is a connective tissue or band, which is creating this elastic tension throughout the body. And so, where's that? On the right, we've got an image of the hip structure. This is created in a way that is helping us to envision those individual bones, and then also starting to see how the muscles will actually be suspending that structure in relation to the rest of the muscles and structure in the body. So if we think about the bridge there is essentially a place where there is stability with the floor, and then there's also this continuity or this tensegrity that pulls everything just the right amount so that it's able to then maintain its form. And then as we move into the dynamic side of movement, it's able to then maintain its form and reciprocate its form as we're doing those movements. And just by the way, I can't see if the messages pop up. So if anyone has questions, please put that into group chat. And Andy, I've got my phone here. So if you message through, then I'll see the message there.
I'm happy to monitor the chat as well.
Super. Yeah, okay. So then what we're going to look at now is more of a human shape. And we can see that we've got head, ribs, and hips, which are the largest structures on the body. And we're able to have something like the head literally balancing on the neck, something like the ribs literally balancing on the spine into the hips, and something like the hips with the ribs and the head on top of it, literally balancing onto the legs. Now, if we have the correct tensegrity or the correct tension in the system in the right places, then what this does is it allows the body to actually be able to maintain its form, its structure in an optimal position. If we start to have tightness in certain areas or flaccidity, looseness in certain areas, then what we start to experience is a change in that structure. Often we're not just gonna we won't just fall onto the floor, but we're going to have a change in our posture, which will start to actually change the way that our body positions and then moves. And then every movement that we do is then coming from the position that we are stabilized into. So an example of this is, say, for example, you have your right dominant, like myself, you have tightness in your right shoulder, and the right shoulder literally moves forward because the muscles are shortening. What happens is that's not just affecting the shoulder. In a system of tensegrity, that shoulder going forward on one side is also then causing a pull at the left hip at the back on one side, and then also on the right hip on the other side, on the same side. So essentially what we're looking to do is find balanced tensegrity, and we're going to go through what this looks like and then what we can do to be able to achieve that. So on the right, we've got that tensegrity structure, and you can just see how we have these nodules where there's a stabilization or a connection. And then we also have these lines, which are these lines of tension. And Thomas Myers, there's going to be a book resource for the lesson today and tomorrow, and then also 2 video resources as well. And we're going to discuss that a little bit more a little bit later. But essentially, Thomas Myers has this concept of anatomy trains, which it's bony stations and then myofascial tracts. And essentially these bony stations are where there's not going to be much movement, but those are connected to other locations through those myofascial tracts. And so a really good example of this is when we talk about the most adapted and evolved movements that humans have formed around, which is gait cycle, walking, running, sprinting, and also throwing, swimming. So these movements require us to be able to do that contraction, that concentric contraction. And at the opposite time, there's going to be muscles doing a different type of contraction, which is the eccentric contraction, or that lengthening. And then there's also going to be other muscles which aren't really moving. They're isometric or same distance. And essentially what we'll have is our inner core unit. We've got this spine. I've actually got one somewhere. I'm not going to get it right now. We've got this spine. And essentially the central axiom is rotating about like a stick. Now, I don't know if you can all see this, but essentially if we have any sort of change in that, so say in the middle of our back, we start to flex over, you can have a go at doing that right now, actually. Let's do that. You can get everyone sit up straight, neutral. And then let's just have a little go. Keep your hips still, and we're going to rotate to our right side. And then notice if we rotate around to our left side. And you can just do that one more time and feel the range of motion. Feel spatially, feel what range that you have. Okay. Nice. Now what we're going to do is we're going to flex over a little bit, round your back. And then we're going to rotate round. Okay. How's that range of motion there? Okay, so those different changes in position, well, I'm going to get it. Wait there.
You feel how the body moves naturally and how it doesn't move sometimes.
I love using this with my clients. So I'm just going to, this is Simon. When we rotate, we have an ability to be able to move a lot in certain areas and not so much in other areas. We're going to discuss this a little bit further. But essentially, if you're in certain positions, your vertebrae are stacking. They're floating, but they're stacking. And if we start to apply pressure into a certain location like that, we start to flex over. We then can't actually move as much because we don't have that capacity physically, and the body's going to restrict certain movements to prevent injury. If we were just able to do whatever movements we wanted and we didn't have mechanisms inside of our body to restrict certain movements, if I kick up my leg like that, it just lifts all the way up. That would essentially cause an injury. And the same thing happens when we talk about core stability. We think about core strength. We hear those terms used quite a lot, but what does it mean? Essentially, stability is staying ability. Strength is force control or force creation. So what we're trying to do is actually develop staying ability against forces in our core, so that if I move my arm like this, then my spine doesn't just go like that. Because if I was a monkey swinging in a tree, I would have to be able to hold onto that branch and make sure that it's a high amount of force that's being reciprocated through the body as I was swinging from a tree, or in human evolution as I'm running, as I'm having to do things like our ancestors were hunting things like woolly mammoths. This is a big animal, and that is it's very challenging for the human body to be able to do that. But because we have an amazing capacity to be able to adapt and adjust to our environment and the demands of our environment and our physicality, we're actually able to create amazing structures and perform amazing feats of movement, which essentially is life. All life is movement. If it's not moving, it's not alive, or it's inanimate. So when we look at the quality of our movement, this is actually going to dictate the quality of our form, our function, and therefore our life. Okay. So we started working through what's all the fascia about? We started working through bone and muscle yesterday. And then when we think about fascia, It's not just one layer somewhere. It's actually this interconnecting, interpenetrating form of connective tissue that is connecting everything else in the body together. It holds the muscles and the bones. If you, as the structure is, if you pinch your skin and just lift it up like that, the reason that the skin doesn't just come completely off the muscles is because of fascia. So when we actually think about this, it's not just a segment, it's an entire suit that covers the bones, which allows them to have continuity, so that everything's connected together. Thomas Myers says it as one of his videos. It's not just like everything's connected together. It's not like everything is connected together. It has an impact on the way the entire system functions. And we're going to get into that a little bit more as well. So it helps us to be able to connect and attach things together in our body. It also helps us to be able to stabilize, because fascia has incredible properties that allow it to be very viscoelastic. So when we think of visco or viscosity, we're thinking of the density or the thickness of a liquid. And when we think of elastic, we're thinking of an elastic band, right? So it has this amazing liquid elastic property that allows it to stretch and reciprocate tension like an elastic band. And if we think in terms of movement, I'm going to do this one in a minute. If we think in terms of movement, we need to be really efficient for our movement, because we're having to do it all day, every day. We need to move efficiently. We need to make sure we don't have energy leaks, which is again something we're going to get into a little bit further. So even like trees, everything in nature has a curved structure to it. There's no particular straight lines. Everything's almost created with what we mentioned yesterday about the flower of life. It's a spiral pattern. You see the spiral pattern in everything, from seashells to the wave as it's to galaxies, to the formation of leaves. Everything has, to the formation of humans as an embryo from that flexed position into a more extended position. And essentially, these spiral structures give resiliency to our bodies, and it also makes them very effective, where we move away from linear mechanics, which are straight lines, into spiral mechanics, which allows more of a whip-like movement, which allows faster, more stable movement, and also helps to maintain our body in terms of health. So the human structure is no different to trees. It's no different to anything else which is designed by Source, God, whatever you want to call it. And essentially, one of the most amazing things about fascia is that it's naturally elastic, and 1 square inch of it can hold up to 2,000 pounds of pressure. Could you imagine trying to lift something that has 2,000 pounds? Like if you were lifting that, it would be very, very heavy. How much does a human weigh? I think I weigh about 170, 180 pounds. If you lifted me up, it'd be heavy. But if you were moving, like swinging from a tree, you would have to be able to reciprocate that movement. You would have to be able to stabilize, because otherwise our body literally wouldn't be able to cope with the demands of nature. So in terms of our ability to run and that elastic movement that we have, which we're going to discuss more, this has evolved from our ability to swing in trees, which has then evolved from our ability to serpentine movement with these spinal flexions and rotations. So we're going to get into this more tomorrow in terms of movement patterns. Today we're looking at moments. Tomorrow we're going to do more movements. And when we think about a moment, it's like screenshot right now. How's your posture? If you took a screenshot, if you took a picture right now, you would see that your form is positioned in a certain way. If you spend time in a position, bless you, then that conditions into your structure. So the conditioning of your positioning and your functioning is what creates where you're at now. Congratulations, Kristen. Straight up right. Very good. And then another function of fascia is not just that it connects everything, but it also segments things. We're going to see this more in the next slide. So we've got fascia, which is connecting different areas of the structure together. And then we've also got these deeper layers, which are, again, it's still fascia. They're not connected by this crisscross, which we're going to cover more. It's connected by a film. So there's like a sheet between the fascial layers around the muscles that allow different muscles to function as part of subsystems in the body to facilitate certain types of movement. Again, we're going to cover those movement patterns more tomorrow. We're going to have a look at what these fascial trains look like, or anatomy trains, as Thomas Meyer calls them. So fascia is mostly collagen. As I mentioned, it's not straight lines. There might be smaller straight lines creating it, but it's not tracing in a straight line like the striation of a muscle, or the form of a muscle that gives it those, like the feather effect. And so it's got this spiraling nature, and it's also a triple helix. So currently right now, our DNA is a double helix. We're moving towards more, but it is a triple helix. So it's 3 forms moving like that. And what this does is kind of like the way if we just have one piece of string and we pull it, we can maybe break it. But if we put 3 pieces of string together and then we twist it and then we try to pull it, it's a lot stronger. And then we have this elastic nature of fascia, which is enabling us to be able to have this reciprocation. So you can see when the monkey swings, a certain area of the body is stretching. And another area of the body, I should say lengthening. We're going to differentiate between stretching and lengthening. A stretch is a stretch response. It's holding a position long enough that the myofascia, the muscles, start to loosen and then lengthen. But the difference is, and this is what we're going to cover more tomorrow, that a lengthening is driven by a contraction. A stretch can just be holding a certain position and then the muscle and the fascia lengthening. And specific stretches can be very useful for improving flexibility, the pliability of muscles, and also then creating the correct conditions for mobility, which is the movement ability available at the joints. And then we're going to go into this more again, stability, which is the staying ability of muscles. So flexibility, how pliable is the muscle? Mobility, what movement ability does the joint have, or collection of them? So we think about the spine, we have 33 vertebrae. If we have too much movement at one particular vertebra or at a small section of the spine, it's a lot of pressure on the discs, and to the point where some of my clients have degenerated discs, scoliosis, kyphosis, all sorts of stuff like that. And just through changing position, we can then reduce the impact of that friction, which is creating inflammation, which then signals as pain. So we want to make sure that the body's functioning optimally, and we need to have just the right amount of flexibility. It's a spectrum. Too little, you can't move. Too much, you can't really stabilize in the position that you need to be in. Mobility. This one's a little bit different. So because we're now going between flexibility and stability, we're going to see this in just a second. We want to make sure that we have a good range of mobility, but we also critically need to make sure that we have control over that range of mobility. Otherwise, there's an increased chance of injury. And to prevent this from happening, the body's just going to go, nope, you can't move. So you might have a restriction of movement, which actually prevents you from being able to move freely, contributes to pain. One of the last people on my mobility course, before we started, he said that he had been diagnosed with osteoarthritis, inflammation of the joint and the bone around it, and literally just through repositioning his shoulder, wasn't in pain. So not going to be inflaming so much, and then can just solidify that position and not going to develop osteoarthritis. If we have a go at feeling what this is like, so from side on, I want you to just let your right shoulder or your left shoulder just go forward. So protract your shoulder forward, let it relax downwards, and then try to lift up your arm. How high can you lift your arm up? Shoulder goes forward, slouchy position, about to there. Yeah. Now what we're going to do is we're going to retract that shoulder, and then we're going to see how much more range of motion we have. So if our shoulder goes forwards, it's now in a restricted position. And if we reposition it here, whoa, very good. Okay, another amazing feature about fascia is that it's very adaptable, and it will lay down more fibers, not in a straight line, but in a direction of strain. So in a pattern of movement. And this actually happens through consistent movement. So as we see with our gait cycle or our walking, running, that because we were having to, it's the way that we move, and because we were having to move this way, we're essentially creating stimulation through the lengthening of the muscles, through the lengthening of the fascia. And as we lengthen it, it doesn't stretch, but those smaller bonds will start to break down and then re-solidify. So it'll start to recreate that structure based on the demand of the environment. And fascia doesn't require any oxygen. So when we think about the capacity of muscles to be able to create a contraction, this is often limited by the amount of oxygen that we can get to the muscles, the amount of hot water that we can get to the muscles, and the amount of waste products that we can clear from the muscles. Because we'll have, everyone's going to be familiar with lactic acid. We've got clearance rates and we've got production rates. So we need to make sure that, and this is important because our body is producing things like lactic acid for a specific reason. And if you've ever done exercise and you feel like that really achiness in the muscles, but when you stop exercising, not necessarily not moving, but when you stop exercising, you then start to feel like a relief from that buildup and acidity in the body. So in terms of exercising, there's other things that can be happening, like muscle soreness from different reasons. But if you do a high intensity exercise session, you will start to notice that your muscles, your signals can't send as well. So by the time you got achy muscles, because of that buildup of acidity in the system, the signals aren't able to actually send as effectively, these electrical currents in the body. So in terms of being able to do lots of movement and being able to adapt and survive in physical situations as these lovely chimpanzees, what we would have to do is actually have really efficient movement. And one of the things that fascia allows is, because it doesn't require oxygen and it has these elastic properties, it allows us to create a movement, and then the body stretches a certain amount or lengthens a certain amount, and then as that does that, the tension in the fascia pulls and then reciprocates. So if we think about running, once you get up to like a certain speed of running, you're not actually needing to really run very fast. You're just needing to strike with floor. And as you do that, rather than having to do, okay, let's do this all together. We did this a lot as children, and we don't really get a chance to do this. And most people don't cover this so much in terms of like running form. And it's super important when we start to look at our footwear, because this biomechanically changes the ability of our body to be able to function. So Andy, standing up. Yes, you. Very good. Okay. If we think about a squat, we are going to push our hips back and we're bending at the hips and the knees. When we think about a lunge, and we're going to get into this more tomorrow, when we think about a lunge, we're doing a squat, but in a split stance position. So we're going to have one leg in front. You can't see this right now. We're going to have one leg in front. I would do that, but my bedroom's a little bit messy. So that's it. Cool. If you can see Andy's camera, fantastic. One leg in front, one leg behind. And then what we're going to do is just slowly descend downwards to the floor, pulling the hips back. And you'll feel hamstrings at the back of the legs and knees flexing. That's it. Really good. And then what we're going to do, if you feel stable to, is if you don't feel stable to, just slowly lifting up, and then you can switch sides and then lunge down. If you feel okay to, what you can do is from that position, jump and switch your feet around. Rocking. And after a few of those, you're probably going to feel the muscles working quite a lot. So if we then think about this connective tissue that has these elastic properties, rather than having to create calorie, energy consuming movements that are very exhausting or fatiguing for the body, we've got these wonderful things called tendons. We've got this fascia in our body that's literally connecting it all together elastically and allows us to reciprocate the energy that we've generated through muscular contractions. So those same lines of tension that we saw on the tensegrity structure, that's in our body. So if we stand up and we're just going to lift the heels just off the floor, about an inch, and then we're going to... Now, which one do you think you can do more of? The jumping lunges or the little jumps like this, where we feel our tendons lengthen every time and then it reciprocates? We're not really having to use large muscles that require lots of energy, but we can do this all day. And then if you start to do opposite legs, you'll start to then reciprocate that energy. When you combine this through the rest of your structure, that movement through our bodies is essentially what's allowing us to be able to move super efficiently, elastically, and through those movements, we're then utilizing that natural structure in our body to then be able to strengthen it further. And it looks something like this. So I'm just going to give you a second to have a look at that. And water break as well. Very good. So we've got these anatomy trains. We have these subsets of muscles which unify together through the compartments of fascia that facilitate specific functions in the body. Make sure I got that here. Essentially, because these different systems contribute to different movements, we can actually start to see what those functions are just based on the position. So now we can see muscles. We know that muscles shorten. We know that muscles lengthen. What do we think these different muscles are going to be doing? So let's take an example of superficial backline. Muscles shortening, the muscles at the back are contracting, we're going to extend. Front line, muscles at the front, muscles shorten, we're going to bend. Lateral line, now this is a little bit different. We might have a lateral line doing something where we go side to side, or it might just be that it's not moving as much in terms of directing the movement, but essentially what it's doing is stabilizing that movement on the side of the body. Same thing with the spiral lines. These are going from the feet, and it's really important with the fascia, as you can literally see the toes are connected all the way to the head. The spiral line has functions all the way from the back of the head, comes down underneath the shoulder blades, round the front, and then to the opposite side. So what's this allowing us to do? Spiral type movements, more circular type movements, the way that everything in nature moves in this parabola or this semicircle type movement. And one that we haven't got on here in the muscles, we have got just above it, where we see between the spiral line and the arm line, and we go upwards to there, we see chest into core, and then downwards across into our adductors. These are known as the functional lines. These are where the muscles create a cross formation from here into here. And so as the muscles shorten on one side, we get a movement like that. And on the opposite side, we have the opposite movement. So we've got a shortening from my right shoulder down to my left knee. And then from my left shoulder down to my right knee, there's a lengthening. So what's going to happen if I'm in motion? Reciprocation. And essentially these slings, the two there where they've got slightly shorter legs, they have got the anterior oblique sling, which is essentially involving the oblique muscles that we talked about in the core, which, let's do this. Next to our hip here, we've got the internal oblique muscles. So these are the inside ones, and these go from the hips up into the core, and they striate like that. They line like that, and then like that as well. On the outside of those, we have the external oblique muscles, which go downwards like that. And so we've got one on one side going upwards, one on one side going downwards. And so when these muscles shorten, it's like that. And if I just do that, you can see that striation on the top. Right? So the fascia is this fabric in and around our body that's allowing us to be able to maintain our structure and also to be able to maintain that dynamically through movement. We then also have things like the arm lines, as Andy was saying yesterday. Like, where does your arm start? At your shoulder? It actually connects all the way into your spine. And when we start to think about those movement patterns, it's a little bit confusing. You might think that flexion, like closing of an angle, and then so we think about the shoulder, you think about, okay, so it's going to go like that. Essentially, we can just think about global movements. So we have local movements, which happens at a specific location. So shoulder can internally rotate, it can externally rotate, it can flex, it can extend, it can abduct away from the body, or it can adduct towards the body. And then it can combine all of those movements in lots of different ways. Now, we're going to get more into the mobility stability side of this soon. But essentially, what we're wanting to do is find just the right amount of movement across the whole body. Again, if we think about the spine, a lot of people have lower back pain because they have compression, tightness, restriction in that area. That's a lot of pressure pushing onto the disc, the nerves, and the bone there. What we want to do is be able to make sure we've got just the right amount of moving, so that if I do a movement like this and extend backwards, it's not on one particular location, it's actually distributed across the entire body. When we have those kind of full body movements, we're actually using the body as a whole system. Quite a lot of what we see in terms of modern weightlifting and like traditional training like that is it's isolation. It's one muscle. I was doing bicep curls rather than I was doing a throw, and part of that is elbow flexion, which looks like a bicep curl, which is just a name for that type of movement. So, and then of course the deep front line. I believe when Andy clicked on the muscles and she went down to the first layer, this was it, connecting all the way from the temporals through the spine and then down into the legs. And again, let's try this one, standing up. When we think about posture, should I tell you this? Okay, I'm telling you this, but I want you to forget about this when you take your pictures. You don't have to share the pictures with everyone, don't worry. But when we think about our posture, we're going to use these anatomical markers. So anatomy markers, and the anatomy markers, you got it. The first one we're going to do is the top of the pelvis. So I'm going to feel for the top of the pelvis here. If I push into my side with my hand, I'm going to feel squidgy. And then I've got the hip there, which is solid. And then I'll work upwards and I've got the ribs there. So I want to feel for the top of this pelvic crest here. And you'll just feel a little nodule. Now, when we think about alignment, we're thinking about a straight line. If I've got something like this, I've got a candle. If it's aligned, sweet. If there's anything happening, it's going to do that. Now, it's not just going to do that in our body. We're actually going to have like more of a movement change on our positions, which will then actually affect the position of, say, for example, our head. Our head's meant to be structured here. If it goes forwards, rather than it weighing 10 pounds, it weighs 20 pounds. Another inch forward, rather than weighing 20, it weighs 30. Another inch, 40 pounds. And by the time that our head's conditioned into this position, we're experiencing pain, and it's referred pain. So it's happening from somewhere, but it's going somewhere else, like, for example, our shoulders. And what we're needing to look at is actually seeing what that alignment is and what we can do to be able to create optimal alignment. So again, we've got our hip markers. When we think about our feet, should our feet be closer together, further away? Should one be direct underneath the hips and the other one like there? Do we lean into it like that? When we think about this position, we want to have our hips directly aligned all the way to our heels. And then when we think side on, again, we want to have our ankle aligned up to our knee, or just the tuberosity, the little bony part on the side of the leg. So if you feel to the knee and you feel just onto the outside of the knee, you'll feel a little bony prominence. Okay, that's the side of the two shin bones there. And what we want to do is have that in a vertical alignment with our ankle, and then from the knee up to the tuberosity on the side of the hip. So if you feel for that hip prominence and you just work outwards to the side a little bit and just down a little bit, you'll notice there's that round circular prominence, and that's the top of the femur bone. So it's like that, and then it plugs into the socket. So if we're just thinking from feet to hips, essentially, we're going to try and get that vertical stacking. If our knees go forward, the bones aren't lengthening, the hips are going forward as well. If the knees go back, if we lock our legs out, the bones aren't lengthening. There's going to have to be a change in the structure somewhere else. And usually what we'll find is, let's try this. Lock your knees out and just feel into your lower back. Do you notice that you can feel more tension into your lower back when you lock your knees out? And then if you just relax your knees, if you soften your knees, do you notice how that tension moves more into the muscles and less onto the bone in the middle? If not, comment in the group. Let us know, what can you feel? Where can you feel it? And we're going to cover this more. So any questions and stuff, any specifics, let me know, and then we can always go through that. Seated, lovely. Hello, welcome. What we're going to do is go on to the next slide now. You've had a look at how it looks on a muscular structure. Hello.
1 second. I want, while this slide is up, thank you, to point out the blue lines on the body, or even the purple lines on the skeletons above. I want you to just earmark these in reference to what we will be doing later in the semester, which is Chinese medicine and the meridians. Okay, earmark.
No, fantastic point. Because that's just a load of woo-woo, Andy. Don't be silly. Meridians and energy don't exist. But what we do have is myofascial meridians, where there's this kind of elastic, really conductive lines of condensed in certain places fascia, which is now what Western medicine is understanding as, oh, electricity passes more through certain paces. And electricity, yeah, it's kind of is energy. So yeah, we do actually have those energetic meridians in certain places in the body. There's another thing which I'm not going to go into today, which is called the PVS, or the primovasculature system. And this is, again, only been discovered in the past, I think it's like 70 years. And this gives a lot more form to the understanding that there are these energetic pathways. So rocking, great stuff. Cool. We've talked about this, and we can go into it a little bit more complexly. I have a multiple color 7-layer structure that I'm not going to show you right now. I'm going to show you that tomorrow, because then we're going to make it application of posture. And essentially, we've got our base of flexibility. And we can think of flexibility as an attribute, but also as an ability. So the attribute will be, you've got muscles, they do those movements, it's a mass. The ability is, they do those movements. Can they do those movements? Can they express that movement? Mobility being that movement ability, and then stability being that staying ability, or the ability to control the movements that you have the mobility to express through flexibility in the muscles. But it's like a sandwich. It's a mobility sandwich between flexibility and then stability. So too much flexibility, you haven't got the correct tension in the system, the bridge falls down. Too much stability in one particular area, and you've got a tension point where there's going to be other areas having to stretch too much, and your body can lock short, and your body can then also lock long. And we're going to describe what lock means a little bit more, because essentially the myofascia is really important for hydration. It's really important for nutrition, and it's yes, got the water. Yeah, everyone have a glass of water. When we move, we are hydrating the body. We're needing to move the water around to be able to do these different functions in the body. When we don't move, as we know, there's stagnancy. That starts to decrease the movement of the fluid, which is a viscoelastic structure when we talk about the fascia, which means that the water movement in the elastic structure gives it that property of elasticity. If it doesn't have that property of elasticity, there's going to be a buildup of friction. If there's a buildup of friction, there's a buildup of itis, there's heat. And so that's creating inflammation. So we need to make sure that our myofascia can move well and that it's hydrated, because otherwise we're going to have restrictions in our movement, and that's going to create health problems. And when we start to think about idleness and sitting still, you're getting better at that. And especially if you're on your laptop, if you've just been making a presentation and you're sitting up until 1 a.m. in the morning, it doesn't matter if you've been like sitting in that position and then you go and move. While you were sitting in that position, the experience of stress through your nervous system was telling your body, not this muscle gets stronger, this position gets stronger. Your body conditions positionally. So we have to think, if you close your eyes right now and you lift an arm up, your body can't see, it feels where the position is in space. I can clap here, I can clap here. Hey. And essentially what we're wanting to do is change the way that our body can see things by feeling spatially. You'll notice sometimes if you shift into a broad focus where you're looking, but you're allowing yourself to see on a broader level rather than looking at a specific thing, you're often not looking at something. That's when you shift into, like, for example, like daydream mode. You start to feel spatially. You're not thinking about something that you're looking at. Your eyes are just open. You're feeling spatially at the same time. So flexibility and mobility, tomorrow we're going to classify as one thing: movement ability. Stability, staying ability, when we think about something like the arm line that starts at the shoulder blade, we think about the shoulder blade. It's got movements, it's got elevation, it's got depression, it's got protraction, it's got retraction. When we think about...
Go on. Oh, wait.
When we think about this protraction, retraction, elevation, and depression, we've also got this movement at the shoulders happening. So when we do any sort of natural movement, if you throw something, the shoulder blade is going to be moving, but it's more doing stability movement rather than movability movement. The shoulder blade will stay in the same position more so than the shoulder will, and we can see that from the structure of the joint. The most movable joints in the body are the ball and socket joints. They allow the greatest expression of movement. Did you want to...
Yeah, and it's great that we're talking about the shoulder with this, because I want to share anecdotal evidence, perhaps, as to the importance of hydration, to have fascia that frees movement versus fascia that restricts movement. Again, the Latin root word, which Daniel shared with us, of fascia is, of course, band. Right? So you can think of something banded in where you don't really have much movement, or it feels like a tightness, like a straitjacket, a kind of restriction. And I've done extensive experiments where, maybe a yoga student or someone I work with or someone's come in and, I put my hand on their shoulder and massage their shoulder a little bit and say, wow, you're really tight. And they say, yeah, oh my God, so much tension here, whatever it is. And the only thing I tell them to do is go away. And I say, drink 3 liters of water a day. Right? They come back the next week and they're like, holy shit, like my whole life was the same. Everything was the same. I had the same stress, but now all of a sudden I'm free and I feel great in my body. right? And it's just that small hydrated fascia. And you can think of this like something bound in or bound by something dry and hard, right? Versus something supple and hydrated. It's that simple.
Rock and roll. Yeah, very good. And what happens in that process is that the fascia in with the fluid moving through it, which is the extracellular matrix. We're not going to cover that too much in this one, but we've got the cell, we've got the matrix of cells, and the extracellular matrix is this like collection of different fluids and things in the fluids, like cells that do things like building fascia and stuff like that. And essentially what happens is same with the cells throughout the rest of our body, as Andy says, they're eating and they're pooping. Essentially what happens is that through the waste products in our body, when there's a decrease of flow in our fascia, it actually begins to calcify. So that tightness, that restriction in the bands, it actually begins to calcify and solidify into that position. And there's a really good example of this, some of you might actually be aware of. There's that dude in India who decided he was going to raise his arm to Shiva in a tribute and then keep it there. And essentially, can you imagine, the rest of his body now has the flow from the arm, but it's staying in that position. So the position is conditioning. And then essentially, it begins to become firmer and more fibrous, and there's less flow through that arm. And essentially, this is what happens, not at such like an extreme level on all of our bodies, but this is essentially what's happening all the time. So we spend time in particular positions, or now another big culprit of this is traditional weightlifting. When you are doing things that compress and then your structure isn't able to then tension or lengthen, there isn't a tensile property to it, it stays compressed. If it stays compressed, usually with a sponge, if we pop like a sponge into water and we compress it, when it decompresses, it's got more room for fluid. And so this is why this movement is essential, because if it's not able to compress and then lengthen or tension, we're going to cover the rest of the forces and movements and stuff tomorrow, then it's not actually able to hydrate fully. And so when we are moving and assessing posture, we're essentially needing to look at those areas that are compressed and those areas that are tensioned. And it's my very technical model here. We got some bands. Okay, if this band shortens, this band lengthens. What's happened on this one? There's less tension, or less less tension. It's that tensile force. And then this one develops more tension there. So when we think about, I'm going to go scroll back to this one. When we think about all of those bands connected between those different anatomical points, there's a length tension relationship. And that looks like a chart. And then there's a bell curve. So it'll go like that, and it'll go up, and then it'll go down, right? And there's that midpoint where there's just the right amount of tension. The muscles are in just, the muscles are lengthened in just the right places to just the right amount, so that the tension in the system is decreased. And when I say tension, I'm not talking about tensile force, which is a lengthening. I'm using that generic word of tension, which is more like there's like stacking, there's compression happening on the spine. So we think of tension, we feel tension in our lower back, but that's not where the tension is necessarily happening. That's where the compression is happening. So just important to distinguish for when you are all describing posture. Okay. And then, super important to understand, is that we have different locations in the body which have evolved for different functions. So we've got mobility, we've got stability. Now, our body is designed, so example, we talked about the hip joint, we've got a ball and socket joint, same as the shoulders, and those are designed to create or facilitate mobility, lots of movement. And the shoulders even a little bit further out the socket compared to the hips. So they can express more movement, but they're more prone to injury. right? So if we don't find the right thing at the right place, it then goes to the next immediate area. So for example, when people say that they have a knee problem, it's referred pain. The problem's not at the knee. The problem's at the hip, which is probably coming closer to the problems at the spine. If we're talking about the spine, we're talking about the problems actually happening from the neurological wiring, the nervous system. And so this might be a little bit early for this woo-woo, but I'm going to do it anyway. Sims. We've all seen like a video game like Sims, where you have a character on a screen and you are the energy that is actioning the character in that world. So you've got the character, the physical body, the physical structure. I've got a little Buddha here. You've got the physical body. You've then also got the software. So the physical body is the hardware. It's the computer that you're on right now. Mobile phone, a tablet. You've then also got the software. It's the operating system that operates in the hardware. And then you've got your soul, which is like the thing, the you that's operating on the hardware that operates the software. And so your mind or your neurological patterning is essentially the operating system that allows your body to be able to function, right? So we'll go into this more. Any questions? Christian, take a deep breath in. I see you. Hello. Essentially, what we're going to be doing is then looking at why there's changes in that neurological software. So if there's signals for contracting and if there's signals for lengthening, which is kind of like a controlled contraction, but it's driven by a concentric contraction. So as we shorten the muscle, that causes the other muscles to lengthen, which again, we've differentiated. There's a difference between lengthening and stretching. The stretching is a stretch response. The lengthening is a stretching of the muscle, but it's driven from a contraction in the muscle somewhere else. So for example, I'm right dominant. I spend more time using my right hand. I'm writing. I'm on my phone. I'm probably on my phone in a position that I probably shouldn't be so much, like that. Sometimes I always check myself, though, because if you coach other people, you got to do it for yourself. And essentially, if I have, close your eyes for a second. Let's do this one. You don't need to see anything right now. Close your eyes. If I can feel the sensation in my body of electricity, what I can feel then is that there is this movement of energy happening in my body prior to any actual physical structure changing. So we have that software that's connecting into certain parts of the body. Our nervous system is directing these electrical impulses. So what I want you to do is I want you to think about contracting your right arm, your chest, your shoulder, and I want you to think about contracting that. And then I want you to slowly do it. Elevate your arm up. Feel which muscles contract, shorten. And then what we're going to do is we're going to then, so when we do this, it's shoulder flexion. Then we're then going to do shoulder extension. So we're going to think about these muscles at the back. Muscles at the back. I'm not going to go into too much, just the back muscles, shoulder blade muscles, back of the arm. And then think about those shortening and then extend the arm downwards. Bring the arm back behind the body. Feel those muscles contracting. Okay, and then just relax there. Those individual muscles are signaled by the nervous system to do those movements. Your function, the position that you function from, is going to be like the presettings to the way that your body is going to move, and the way that your body's moving is going to be the feedback in terms of messages. So like the intensity of the movement that you do, if you do a super fast movement, everything jolts up because your body's trying to restrict injury. If you do a super heavy movement, everything's going to lock up because your body needs more stability. So it's going to try and prevent injuries in that way. And then essentially, if you are thinking of a movement and then you're doing that movement and then the movement is creating a shortening in certain areas, unless we have a balance in the signals and the contractions in the muscle, well, we're just going to condition into that position, right? So if we sit at our shoulders and if we slump in our sitting position and we spend time in that sitting position, and then we instill that position through time with stress, which is a signal to the body which says, this is happening, adapt to this. What that does is essentially creates a stronger position, right? Not necessarily an optimal position, but a stronger position. So when we think about these different areas of the body, we can see here, the lower back is a stability area. We need the base of our spine, the base of not our tensegrity structure, but the center of our tensegrity structure. The base of our tensegrity structure will be whatever's on the floor or whatever we're holding on to, necessarily if we're in a tree. And then the next areas out are for mobility. So then we've got mobility in our upper back, mid back, upper back. We've then got mobility in our hips. Now, if we sit down and the muscles tighten at the front on the hips, and the muscles spend time in that tightened position, they become conditioned into that position, well, then the hips aren't a mobility joint anymore, are they? They're not functioning like a mobility joint. The same as our shoulder. If the shoulder goes forward, I can lift my arm up to there before I start to feel pain. If I bring my arm to there, I can do that full range of motion out. And then essentially what happens is, if the hips can't move properly, well, they're going to try to look for movement from other places, like the lower back, like the knees. So if we have a restriction at our hip that changes the position just slightly, it's going to change the force distribution through the hip, through the knee, all the way to the ankle. And if it's happening that way, it's also going to be happening that way. So what we want to find out is which areas are meant for mobility. Here's a lovely list. Which areas are meant for stability? The list continues. And then, how's yours? Are you able to keep a certain area of your body still? Are you able to move other certain areas of your body? There's going to be a requirement for flexibility around the whole body. There's going to be a requirement for mobility and stability around the whole body. But how's yours? Do you have the right things in the right places? Do you experience any sort of pain? Has conditioning from positioning and movement caused you to have changes in your anatomical structure? These are the kind of things that are really essential for maintenance. And these are the kind of things that are factors which are constantly contributing to dehydration, to inflammation. If we take a kinesiological approach to it and we say, okay, so I've got this problem with my spine, but doc, I've also got this problem with my colon. And it's like, okay, well, if you have any sort of problems with your colon, and that's connected through nerves to a certain part of your spine, which is also connected to muscles in the same zones, well, if you have any sort of digestive issues, that can actually contribute to lower back problems through those pathways. Like literally, if you have lower back problems, well, that change in the electrical signals that are passing through that nerve can start to, as seen, get faster. Sometimes you might feel like twitching muscles. And as we start to see this happen more in degenerative conditions, you might start to actually see this change in ability to control those impulses of signals. And then essentially from these changes, they can get faster, they can get slower, and they can also become less coherent. So it's like this flow, this constant stream of electrical signals through your body, and through changes on the hardware, the physical structure, the bones, the nerves, the muscles, the fascia, which is innervated or energy fed into the fascia, this can actually change the way that this electrical signal is passing through the body, and therefore changing the function of the entire body in many different ways. Now, if we have a problem like lower back problem, you've sat in a position for a particular amount of time, your lower back starts to get tight. That then starts to become a conditioned position. Your posture is now changing. You're now operating from a posture, a pose like a post, for a duration of time, to the point where that actual contraction, that position change, is now starting to change the way that the electricity is feeding into your organs, your muscles, really importantly, your glands. And then that might start to affect, say, for example, in your intestines, in your gut, the inflammation, which is then going to start to actually then also cause a cascade in terms of the serotonin production in your gut, which will then also start to cause a change in your operating in your mind, the way that the hormones, the chemicals are signaling your brain to function. So you've got this interconnected layer of conditioning in terms of your energy centers, in terms of how those energy centers function like an electrical circuit through your nervous system, how that nervous system is then innervating the glands, organs, and muscles, and how that is then creating the feedback in every moment that makes something like a knot in your shoulder into an effect on every single thought process throughout the day. How does that change your frequency in terms of an emotional level? How does that change your outlook and the way that you are reacting or responding in through stress and in life every day? There's a healthy amount of stress, there's healthy forms of stress, and those are adaptive. They allow you to actually adapt in positive, healthy ways, like getting your heart rate up every day, like doing exercise that stimulates positive adaptations. And then there's also maladaptive, like when you feel depressed and you don't go and express yourself, you lay down in bed. I have days like that sometimes, it's all good. When you don't go and express yourself, well, what's happening to the muscles? They're constantly shortening. So then tension's building up in the system. And long-term, does that help you to feel better? So we have to think objectively in terms of our subjective experience so that we can start to determine what we're feeling, what we're sensing, and then what we need to do to be able to objectively improve that so that we can have optimal functionality, health, and then vitality, well-being. So you've got this here to refer to. What we're then going to do is this one. I'm not going to go through all of this because it's a lot of words there, but what I want you to just think of in terms of these elements, let's come on screen, is there's tonic muscles, toning muscles, and then there's phasic muscles, muscles that phase in activity. So these tonic muscles are, you guessed it, posture, and their susceptibility to fatigue while we're using them all the time. So do you think these ones are going to be more susceptible to fatigue or less susceptible? These are less susceptible. They're late susceptibility to fatigue, which just means that if you fatigue, it's not going to be these muscles first, it's going to be the other muscles. And then you've also got reaction to faulty loading. So if we move too fast for our capacity to be able to stabilize our body, well, what's going to happen? They're going to shorten, they're going to lock up. If we move, okay, no, that's good. And then different examples of these muscles. A few of them, we've got pec minor, as we mentioned, the deeper chest muscle, which goes from the shoulder downwards. It causes this anterior tilt or forward tilt at the shoulder, all the way through into, like we mentioned yesterday, the lower back muscles. So when we start to see a posture like we've got here on the right, why are those muscles doing those things? Why is that a condition of the human species? Well, because most people have sit-down syndrome. The syndrome is those muscles are tightening up because here's the physiology for how we've evolved. And then we put those muscles in a particular position. And you can think about this as well. When we are created from dear mother, we evolve in this position. We then stand up and we go into this position. So we go from contracted consciousness into expanded consciousness, right? And have a look at the muscles. Flexion muscles, extension muscles. Trunk, flexion muscles, or extension muscles, opposite way in certain parts of the body. So what we want to do is make sure that we're lengthening the ones which are constantly going to be shortening more, and then shortening the ones which are constantly going to be lengthening more. That's a very general, vague way of saying it. What I really want you to look at is how's yours? Which one does yours look like? These are all different types of posture. which can happen to varying degrees. These are generalized patterns of conditioning. So neutral, nicely stacked. Very good. Lordosis, we're going to start to get this tilt. Now there's compression on the lower back. There's a shortening of the muscles there. Rocking. Okay. Kyphosis, we're actually going to start to get the upper back rounding. Okay. When we start to look at flat back, these movements with the knees and hips are happening, which are going to change those physical structures because we have that force length relationship. There's a certain condition, bless you, length in, say, for example, the quadriceps, the muscles at the front, say, for example, the hamstrings, the muscles at the back. And if we change those, if we have too much flexibility in one place or the other, what happens if we have too much posterior chain flexibility in the chain of muscles at the back? They're going to lengthen. What happens when it comes up to our back? Well, our back is prioritizing, our body is prioritizing our spine and our brain. This is the most important thing to the body. This is an extension of the brain, and the whole body is an extension of that. And it kind of looks like a sperm cell, right? Like you've got this thing at the top, and then it's got like a tail, and that's like a body there. Look at the scoliosis one is swimming. And essentially, we have evolved embryonically from these specific structures, which, again, if you look at a sperm cell, then you look at the way that a fish moves. Well, it's that same serpentine type movement, right? But the problem is, if we come conditioned into a position, there's then going to be an inability to be able to actually intend what we want to happen when we move. So when I say that we're aiming for superior control over our physical body, over our mental as well, and over our minds, you know, it's all connected. Essentially, we want above control. If we think about intention, well, attention is a focusing, so intention is a focusing of our attention. And when we are conditioned by habit, this tightness in certain areas of our body can actually prevent us from being able to intend and move the body the way we want it to. So we have to develop superior control, or control above the body, control above the habits of the body, so that we can manifest our intentions without restrictions. And what you're going to be doing is going to be a worksheet, going to be a few things that you're going to describe and talk about. And I want you to tell yourself why it's important. And if you don't know, let's talk about that more, because it is super important. If I haven't made that clear yet already, let's have more of a chat. And if you have any sort of particular considerations, let me know, and then I'm happy to talk to you about that. In terms of the homework, what you're going to be doing, I want you to describe what's happening here. We've talked about compression, tension. You can see what's happening at different areas in the body, and you're going to be describing what happens during, I think it's kyphosis and scoliosis. And there is getting it right and there is getting it wrong, because duality and singularity are two sides of the same coin. And it's, you know, in terms of what we're talking about, and just bear with me here. In terms of right and wrong, we're looking at that process, and we're not looking at right or wrong as it's a general thing for everyone. We're just looking at a process, and we're going to say an example. If I want to walk through my door frame, if I just walk into the door, that's the wrong thing to do for being able to use the door again. The right thing to do would be to open the door handle. So in terms of what's happening here, we're not thinking about what's right and wrong for everyone. We're just thinking about what's right for what we can see on the physical position. So if we notice that there's compression on your lower back and you have pain in your lower back, what do we need to do there? We need to decrease that level of compression on your lower back. Now, when we do this, here's the forces. Compression, a shortening. Lengthening is tension. A shear is a force going from two different directions. A torsion is a rotational force, and a bending is a lengthening in one place and a shortening in another place. when we think about the nervous system, when we think about the software which is installed and operating consistently to create the positioning, to create those habits of movement, which are, you'll observe yourself doing all the time. You move from one position to another position to another position, and you're looking outside, but you're also noticing what you're doing inside. Yes. Essentially, what we're going to be doing is seeing where these forces are applied on the body. And all of the other forces, the shear, the torsion, and the bending, they're just combinations of compression and tension. So shortening and lengthening, right? So if you see a shortening in a certain area of the body, like your lower back, let's have a look at lordosis. There's a shortening in the lower back. Okay, that's a compression. That means that there's tension or lengthening in the front of the body. So what do we want to do? We want to tension the lower back and increase the length there. And then we want to decrease the length of the front so that we can then bring that compression from the lower back, from the tight lower back muscles. And we want to bring that when we do, you might hear people say, and like release all that tension. It doesn't release, it just redistributes to somewhere else in the body. So as we start to decrease or redistribute the tension from the back of the body, it's going to go to the front of the body. And then that's going to go from your QL muscles, your erector spinae in the lower portion of your lower back, and that's going to go onto your transverse abdominal. So we can have a go at doing this as well. And if we align ourselves in a neutral hip position from, you can't see it all the way right now, but I want you to just visualize those legs, ankles to knees to hips. If my hips go forward, what's happening with my lower back? If my hips go back, I can still be in this tilted position. If I tilt my back to there, what's just happened to the front? my cousin told me one time, she goes, Tiama, I need to do something about this. And I was like, no, you're just not looking at the full picture. You need to do something about that. That does that. And you mentioned it yesterday, inhibition of muscles, inhibition, not being able to habit. So the inhibition of those muscles means that through positioning, certain muscles are overactive, certain muscles are underactive. And that means that muscles like the transverse abdomini, which are meant for compression, that corset effect, it's stabilizing the spine. The muscles here shorten and they create stability around the spine through compression. What this does is it decreases movement variability, which we think the movement variability is really essential. It is, but intentionally. In a habit, if you start to run too fast and your spine starts moving around too much, well, it's not good. It's going to cause some sort of outcome which could be creating injury or pain. So we want to try and avoid that, and we do that by making sure that we're contracting the right muscles. So we've got these different types of posture, and you're going to describe a few of them because you might have good posture. So I want to make sure that you can still just describe them and talk about that so you can see it on other people. You can do all of them if you would like to. Get really good at this, because once you know how to do it, you've got that for life. Forces, they're going to be applied. And we've got one thing that we've constantly got is the force of gravity. So this is an external force which is constantly shortening us. You're taller at the start of the day than you are at the end of the day. This will happen now. No, what we're going to do instead is actually make sure that we're tensioning, redistributing that around our body in a way that we can actually prevent compression creating degeneration in our body. So what I want you to think of now, we're going to do an example. What I want you to feel for is between your collarbone and your shoulder blade, you've got this muscle here. So Andy showed the trapezius muscle, which starts here, it goes to here, and it goes to here on the back of the body. When we feel, if you make crab claws with your hands and you just pinch these muscles here on the top of the body, if you shrug your shoulders up, you'll notice those muscles getting tight, and then just relax your shoulders down. Okay, squeeze it on the left side, squeeze it on the right side. Where do you feel more sensation when you do that? Can you feel one side's like, ooh? Because if you can, what do we think we need to do there? Not so much? Rocking? Cool. Some of you might have been stretching them out. Very good. If you notice that you have more tension, we're going to do release work to release the tension. It's not disappearing. It's just going to move somewhere else in the body. So what you can do is just a simple practice for that is you can just squeeze and hold. And you can just squeeze and hold for 2 minutes. You don't want to do it for anything less than really like a minute, but you can squeeze and hold like that. Rocking. If you don't feel too much tension there, you can also try thumb into the armpit, back of the arm. There, if you feel more tension there, you can squeeze and hold there. If you feel it more on top, you can squeeze and hold there. Third location is the pec muscles. So these are the main muscles around the shoulder. If we squeeze and hold there, you might notice it's the fingers underneath and then thumb on top, squeeze. You might notice more tension there. So find out which location has more restriction around it. More there, okay? Which location has more restriction, and then you just want to hold applied pressure there. And through the mechanoreceptors, which means receptors in your body which are receiving mechanical information and then feedbacking that to the brain and then back to the muscles through that applied pressure. Same way when you sit down for a long enough amount of time, your bum goes numb. What happens when your bum goes numb? You're sitting on the muscles to the point where the muscles are relaxing, and then you start to apply more pressure onto the nerves. Then you get the tinglies. And so that's what we want to do, but in the right places. If we do that too much on the bum, we're sitting down a lot, what's going to happen? The muscles at the back are lengthening, muscles at the front are shortening. And so what we're going to get is a tilt of the hips. Anterior tilt, as we see kyphosis there and lordosis. That tilt of the hips forwards is a lengthening at the back and a shortening at the front. So we need to make sure that we're looking at those patterns. And then the main question is, how does this really apply to eye? How's your posture? Here are some postural changes, which what we're going to be doing is taking these initial photos, so like the ones on the far left, and then a progress photo. Now, you don't have to share these with me. You don't have to share them with anyone, but now you know what to look for. So anterior, front, lateral, side, posterior, back. And then you're going to describe what you see on your posture. What might be the cause of the effects that you feel in your posture? And what might be the effects of that in terms of what you can see? So say, for example, lower back compression. And then, well, what might be the probable cause of that? Now, I've worked with a lady who had scoliosis, and we've all really got a form of scoliosis. It's like none of us are like exempt from this. It's just decreasing it to like a functional optimal level. Now, scoliosis there, lateral movement of the spine, okay? And it's these rotations that happen on the vertebrae in different ways, so that can rotate this way a little bit like that, but then the head's going to rotate back that way, and then this is going to create all sorts of different movements in the spine. It can get a little bit complex, so you can always feel free to reach out to me. When we think about your posture and the cause and effect of your posture, when I had this lady working with her quite severe scoliosis, the doctors told her her only option was pills and surgery. I've heard this numerous times with many different people. The only option is pills and surgery. We're going to have to numb you, and then we're going to have to cut it out because we don't actually realize what's going on with the body or have a system to be able to undo that. Physiotherapy does this, but it's still looking at a very isolative way, which when you start to think about how the body's connected, that something like flat arches in our feet can actually be more connected to the balance of our thigh muscles and our core muscles than our feet. And as soon as we make those adjustments, the whole tensegrity structure tensons up into just the right position. So you're going to be describing your postural positioning and conditioning. And with that lovely client of mine, essentially, we're going through all these things. I'm like, why has this happened? She's like, I sit on the couch like that, knees up here. So you've got this massive curvature in your spine, and you sit in that spine curved position for several hours every day. Okay, stop doing that. Sit in the opposite direction a little bit. That'll start to undo it, but we need to apply that as actual, doesn't have to be corrective exercises necessarily, but the exercises that you do should start to direct you towards a position that is optimal for your structure. Brilliant. So just to recap, The form of fascia is relative to the function of movement. The fascia is creating its pathways in response to our inherited and applied movement. So what we've got from our ancestors and then what we do in our life, which means that we can change our entire structure, which means that muscles aren't just going to be short or cut out of the body, which means that changes in our bones can actually happen from changes in our posture, but that in 7 years' time, we can actually start to morph our bones into different structures and create a malleable cytoskeleton, which allows us to be able to really manifest our intention, the intention of our soul into our life by changing our body, by creating the best possible, by creating a more powerful possibility, the possibility to apply the power of your spirit through your body so that you can do what you were born to do. And doing this mentally and doing this physically. So fascia facilitates movement. It also has the capacity to respond to a lack of movement. If you're idle, you're going to get better at that. And then when you want to move, you're going to be better at being idle. So you'll then have to adapt, and that might take time and specific movements, because a lot of the time we do things, for example, like sitting. Thank you for everyone for being really patient. We do things like sitting, but essentially we don't then do just the correct things for being able to balance the effects of that sitting. So without movement, the chances are that stiffness and thereby lack of fluid will result. And there's a lack of fluid, there's a lack of movement of that fluid, there's going to be an increase in calcification. We are raising our arm to Shiva, but Shiva's like, no, man, use your arm. We have trees for being trees. You're a human. You got to do the movement. And then the outcome of that is the stiffness that most of us will have experienced at some stage or the other, but which, if left to continue, it will get worse. If we don't do something about tonic muscles, which are more prone to becoming tonic, what are they going to become? Supertonic, to the point where we then have to do there are tools that we use, like a lacrosse ball and a theracane, which are very useful at reducing this tension in the body, but we have to apply it specifically. And when we do things like certain stretches, they might not stretch those areas in the body because the fascia can hold up to, say, for example, we want to stretch our posterior chain, but we have a high amount of tension in our lower back, and per square inch, that's 2,000 pounds of pressure. Where's going to stretch? Is it going to be the lower back? It's going to be the rest of the body, right? So we want to make sure that we're addressing those. And there's something, you're going to send this so everyone can just have a look at this in their own time as well. There's a pathway to being able to do this, which I apply with people that I work with. And we're going to be, I'm already doing a mobility course throughout the month, which is 1 hour of myofascia and mobility exercises, which release the restrictions and then reteach the body how to be mobile. That then gives you the capacity to go ahead and do whatever types of movements that you want to maintain your joint health, your structural health for life. One thing with mobility is use it or lose it. You won't really lose it. You'll just become better at whatever else that you're doing. So we have to ask ourselves, what have we evolved to do? What's that primary function? And then how do we adapt to that in our life? How has our bodies changed to that? And if we adapt our bodies to the evolved nature of it, well, then aren't we going to have optimal performance? Yes, we are. Rock and roll. Okay. Thank you, everyone, for your patience and your ears and your time and standing up and sitting down many times. I appreciate that. I hope you all discovered something new about the body and your own body, essentially. And yeah, it's picture time soon. You don't have to show anyone. If you would like help with it, let me know. And when you take pictures, try to do that in I shouldn't say tighter clothing or less clothing, just so that you can really see those anatomical markers. God bless. Andy, over to you.
Thank you so much. Wow, amazing. I think you guys all kind of can understand where we're going this week. We started off with kind of brick and mortar and looking at what it is that creates the human. This is body semester, of course, and we are here to not only understand the building blocks and the pieces, but really how they start to weave together. So now that we've come from that, coming into movement mechanics and obviously understanding how that relates back to everything we learned in our first month when we come to states of equilibrium or dis-ease in the body, and how it's all related. So hopefully this has given you a lot to reflect on, a lot to think about. Often postural things and movement patterns we just take for granted in the human being. And this is something we'll talk about when we get into embodied diagnostics and trying to help your X-ray vision, that when you see someone, you'll start to see certain movement patterns. And I want to reiterate that the intention here isn't that you become a huge movement practice or practitioner yourself. We're not training to be physical therapists or even, I don't know, workout coaches or anything like that. We are simply trying to understand the human body at a deeper level. And so everything that's been shared today was fantastic, incredibly insightful on that realm. And I hope that it will further your own understanding, inquiry of yourself, your own posture, as well as everyone around us.
You heard of muscle memory, right? It doesn't exist. It doesn't exist. No, it doesn't. But what happens is that we have a thickening of the myelin sheath, which is like, there's the pathway and then there's like the sheath around it. So it's kind of like the first time that you walk through somewhere where there's been lots of overgrowth, like a forest or like, yeah. First time you walk through somewhere, it's kind of more like jungle terrain, probably. When you're walking through there, there's lots of stuff. It's difficult to like get that signal through. We're a baby, we're developing, we're just getting used to doing those individual movements before we start to getting to do more complex things. And essentially, the more times that you go through there, you get better at it. And this is actually a really important bit. So you get better at doing that. And what happens is your body responds to that by a thickening of the myelin sheath. So that as a signal sends along the nervous system, that there's actually, it's kind of like electricity in any other setting. There'll be a distribution of that electricity. And that thickening of the myelin sheath allows more effective transmission of signals through the nervous system. Now, the nervous system is also connected to the fascia, which is like a net that encompasses the entire human body. So the signals aren't just outside of the body, it's not just inside of the body through the nervous system, it's also outside of the body through the whole body. And the myofascia is instrumental in actually creating effective force transmission, which is one of the things that what happens before force development is force transmission. So if I want to move like that, what happens is that I first have to think about it, the signal has to go there, and then it has to do that movement. In terms of, let's get a little bit more technical, in terms of your motor and your physical body, you have a ability to be able to create an engram, a motor engram, a signal from the brain to the muscles. And what that does is it's essentially establishing a pattern of neurological wiring that, when fired, activates and creates a certain function in the body. You can think about this as the habit and intention. And essentially, when you are doing that, it takes about 300 to 500 repetitions of something to create a motor engram. It then takes about 3,500 to 5,000 repetitions to change that, not including every time that you then do the old thing. Right? So why are habits so hard to change? Because 95% of your mind is subconscious. Now, when we talk about memory in terms of fascia, doesn't exist. It's not that it doesn't exist, but it's like, what's memory? It's like a pathway, right? But it's a pathway that is something which your awareness is able to reciprocate as something which has previously happened. So memory is directly related to the intensity of emotion that is experienced. Otherwise, it doesn't make a big imprint. Your stability, the adaptations of your body are physically imprinted through the intensity or the stress of the activity, in whichever sense of, like, say you lift a really heavy weight, or say you do a really fast movement, that is going to be more imprinting than a slow movement on your nervous system. Not necessarily on your fascia, because your fascia is going to be adapting more to actually repetitive movements and lots of it than sort of more forceful movements. Now, again, that type of awareness, we have awareness that's connected into certain parts of our body. So think about it then, whatever just came to your head when I said that. Okay. And when you think about that, your mind immediately goes to memories because you have associations the same way that you have muscle associations, in that if I say contract that muscle, you might be able to do that. And if I say do this type of movement with that muscle, you might be able to do that. But there might be a habit of muscle associations which create things like posture, which will prevent you from being able to do that intentionally and may restrict you through habit. So in terms of myofascial memory, emotions are peptides, they're chemicals in the body. Certain combinations create certain states of being, which we have termed through categorization, that these are these type of emotions. And different emotions are present in the body when there's different chemicals in the body. Lo and behold, the body is going to be transporting these round through the system. Something that does happen, and I've had this with people before, and you're doing massage and they go, oh my God, I just saw that experience, or I felt that thing. Like any of the physical senses, we've also had clear versions of them. So anything of your physical senses, there's also a mental version of that. And so if you have a restriction in a certain area of your body, then when you are actually applying pressure there could be stored stuff. There might be stored emotions that are chemicals which have got calcified in a particular area of your body. So you're sitting down working on a particular assignment, and then you start to develop that tightness in a certain area of your body, and that becomes a restriction. And then when you start to release it, that whole experience has just come back. And the things that I see when I think of that, and the things that I think about when I see that or feel that or smell that or anything, it's all interconnected. I think we have completed today.